Thanks, Doug. I've spent a lot of my time in the former Soviet Union. I spent it there in 1980, 1984, 86, 89, 91, 92, and then from 93 to 99, actually. So I was living in Kazakhstan in the 90s, but I spent a lot of time in Ukraine under the Cold War when Yuri Andropov was in power, and just when Gorbachev came into power, and then Yeltsin took power. And then I've been back and forth to Ukraine a lot on Reconstruction and on, well, not Reconstruction, actually state building exercises. And now we're starting the Reconstruction era. So there's a lot of background here. I know many of you are interested in who's playing in this field, and I have some names and things for you afterwards if you want. I can also send Doug a list of contacts at the companies and the organizations. I'll mention many of them during my talk. I think you guys should think about applying there for jobs when you're done. So let me talk about the reconstruction of Ukraine. And what I want to talk about is why Russia invaded, what's been destroyed, how much it's going to cost, and why we still care. Now, why do we care about why they invaded? We didn't spend all that much time on it before. And what I want to try to conclude with you today are these major points. I'll bring these back up again. The reconstruction of Ukraine is, in what I can see, one of the last or final battles in what is putting Russian chauvinism in its place. The Cold War really didn't end. We thought it did. It actually didn't really end, and you can't really discount Russia very often. But in this case, to defeat Ukraine, I will try to show you in the historical context, will be a major blow to Russian chauvinism, which in most historians of the Soviet era will tell you the Soviet Union was merely an extension of the Russian chauvinistic regime. Chauvinism in the broad sense, I don't mean in the narrow DEI sense. Also, military victory in the reconstruction of Ukraine as a result of that and its connection to breaking a major superpower. We don't want three, we want two. So we want to go US and China, not US, China, and Russia. Therefore, it is as important in my view as the struggle going on now in Gaza and Israel. Now, we can argue that for a long, long time if we like. And of course, Israel is important as the only democracy in the Middle East, and it's the foundation of US policy in the Middle East. But you have poli-sci professors here who probably talk about that a lot, and you can go into detail on that. In my view, the defeat of Russian Ukraine is as significant as the defense of Israel. The war started, and I'll conclude with this and go into some detailed background on it, was the deep-seated historical beliefs that Ukraine was a part of the Russian Empire, and it was part of Russian Empire and could no more break away than Texas could break away from the United States. It was not, and I'll go through these things because you may have heard this and they may be discussing it. It was over energy and land is one, securing the energy fields of Ukraine, the nuclear power facilities in Ukraine. I'll show where they are. And it was not over NATO membership. Now, NATO membership is probably a subtext to Russian chauvinism and the need to protect itself with buffer states as it was under the Ottoman Empire. But we tend to think of these things as Americans in shorter views, 200 years, maybe even 100 years, maybe actually after the Civil War onward. Russia has a lot longer history than that. Vladimir was baptized and became saint and became Basil in Crimea in 988. So we're going back a long, long time. These histories and these influencers are deep in what we would call the Russian soul. And I want to keep that in mind. And I think, why does it matter now? Well, it matters for Reconstruction because this battle will never be over unless Ukraine is built strong and unless we build it now. And if we start the reconstruction of Ukraine during the war, that's part of winning the war. We need to build a military-industrial complex in Ukraine. We need to get them into high value added, and we need to bring the human capital that has emigrated, and I'll go through that as well, back to Ukraine. To think of it incorrectly would be to say, let's finish the war, let's make a peace deal with Russia. They'll lie about whatever concessions they want. We'll start to rebuild, and the Russians will come right back in again. That will happen over and over and over again. I'll then go through the 3 rules of best reconstruction that I discussed last time with the Marshall Plan in Japan. Don't worry, if you weren't here, I won't go over them again, but I'll mention them. And they'll be up on the screen. And then a major political goal for Ukraine is to fast track membership in NATO. You'll hear discussions again in the press and among colleagues if you speak with them. European Union is the most important and NATO is too. I would say no. Speaking to investors, and I've been an investor in the Soviet Union. I lost a lot of money in the Soviet Union, putting up a refinery in Kyrgyzstan. That's in Central Asia, just north of Iran, near Uzbekistan. What was really important on our mind was security. In other words, businessmen want to know that Ukraine will become a part of NATO eventually. That's what stimulated the major investment in the Baltic states. Their human capital was good. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. That's what stimulated a lot of the foreign investment, was the security of it, not European Union's status itself. So that's just essentially what I'll go over, but let me go into detail on it. Now, a key thing to remember is there's a very good Russian saying, which it's a joke that they say a lot, and it's a really, really old one, as old as the Americans, and it used to be British beforehand. Keep in mind one thing that I haven't said here. Winston Churchill was asked about Russia during the war and the Allies, the alliance with Stalin and the great powers to defeat Nazi Germany. And he said, let's be very clear, we're going to defeat Germany, but Britain has been sending spies to Russia for 425 years. So this is a long, long competition of great powers, as you can say. The joke the Russians often say is, in America, the definition of a poor man is somebody who looks at a rich man and says, I'm going to work really, really hard until one day I'm as rich as he is. That's the definition of the American dream in their mind. The definition of a poor man in Russia is one who looks at a rich man and says, I'm going to work really hard until he's as poor as I am. And this is a peasant view. It is a view that has run deep through the strains of Russian history. And really, when Ukraine started to do better and better, they couldn't take it. They took over several of the presidencies under Kuchma and others, and when Vladimir Zelensky finally won, that was an affront to the Russian control, to the oligarchs in Moscow, and we could see that Ukraine grew by 9 to 13% in real terms. Russia had declined in growth by negative 4%. It was simply intolerable to the oligarchs in Moscow that Ukraine would be doing better than them. They didn't particularly care about Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltics, Kazakhstan, because they're not Slavic. They were part of a great power grab, but they're not Slavic. Ukraine was different in many respects. So let's go over the first 2 things that you'll hear, which I don't agree with. By the way, this picture is of remembrance of childhood from the great Holodomor, which is the famine in Ukraine in the 1930s. If you want to see, I think it's either on Netflix or Prime, there's a good thing called Stalin's Gold, and it's about Mr. Jones, who was a reporter that went in and revealed the New York Times Pulitzer Prize winner as a stooge for Stalin, and he was the one who got into Ukraine first and showed that at the time, Ukraine was, Soviet Union was doing very well during the global depression. They had foreign exchange, they were able to buy things, build up a military, and he asked himself, how can that be when the world is in a great depression? What he was doing was he was stealing grain from Ukraine, creating a famine in Ukraine where 20 million starved to death, 10 to 20 million, and sold the grain on the open market for foreign exchange. It was one of the most dramatic killings of people in the world for a political cause, which is why Stalin is right up there with Hitler, perhaps even worse, in my view. But Russia invaded Ukraine, people say, for its energy and to regain control of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov ports. I'll show you where they are in a minute if you don't know, but you've probably heard of them already. This would allow Russia to wrap Ukraine into its energy portfolio, and it would allow them to control the point and choke access to the Great Seas, which has been one of their major goals for a long time. I don't think it's right in that regard. First of all, over a century, Russia has controlled lots of energy. In the 1980s, I actually wrote my first book when I was 24 on Soviet offshore oil and gas, and it was all about how Russia had become the largest oil producer in the world and the second largest exporter of oil in the world, second behind Saudi Arabia. It surpassed the United States, which was the largest oil producer in the world. Saudi Arabia was the largest exporter of oil in the world. Russia became the largest producer of oil. It's always had a large supply of oil. It's never ever changed. And even grabbing the oil and gas and the nuclear facilities in Ukraine simply would not be a significant addition to the Russian portfolio anyway. And they always seem to screw it up no matter what they do. It's called Dutch disease. I don't know if you've heard of that term. It's called a resource curse is the other one. I won't go into the exchange rate issues in it, but basically you have too much of one thing, you become a Nigeria or a Russia, whatever. On that point, as an aside, I was an advisor to President Nazarbayev. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was president of Kazakhstan, and he had a lot of oil. And he asked me about how do we manage oil and do a wealth fund? And I gave him examples of the Norwegian wealth fund, the Nigerian wealth fund, the Mexican wealth fund, and the Alaska wealth fund. Showed him that the Norwegians and the Alaskans were doing well, that the Nigerians and the Mexicans were not doing well. And he said, can you tell me why Norway is doing so well and Nigeria is not doing so well? And I said, I have to say, the reason is that the Norwegian fund is run by Norwegians, and the Nigerian fund is run by Nigerians. And so he said, so there's not much hope for Kazakhstan because we're so corrupt. And I said, that's right. You're going to have Dutch disease, you're going to have these issues. Russia has had the same issue forever. They've run into these problems, and I don't think grabbing any more energy was the reason behind it. As for the grain prices and the Ukraine gold, which is so important to the world's feeding, grain prices and commodity prices are pretty unstable. I don't think that was a good reason. The other reason you'll hear, which is a little bit more tied into the chauvinism of Russia, is the strategy of NATO backing Ukraine's entry, the way they did with a whole series of countries from the Baltic states to the Czech Republic to Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Poland, of course, which was the center of the Warsaw Pact. Bill Clinton in 1993 had actually made the decision to push to include the former Warsaw Pact countries in NATO. This reportedly had a big stir in Russia. Then they added Bulgaria, Croatia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia. By 2004, Montenegro and North Macedonia, because the Greeks didn't want it called Macedonia, 2014. And then at the Bucharest conference in 2008, Bush made the statement that he wants Ukraine in NATO. Everybody started going apoplectic, running around like chickens with their heads cut off. And Putin said this is a clear opposition to NATO, and I don't want to put up with it. Biden was perceived at that time, when they decided to go in, right after the pullout of Afghanistan, as relatively weak. I mean, no American president is actually really all that weak, let's be frank. It's fun to make fun of them, but they're not really all that weak. But he certainly wasn't perceived as decisive as, say, Trump could have been, or unpredictable as he could have been, or especially Bush. So all of people were saying, well, the reason why they invaded was because of NATO membership threatening in the background. I don't think that was true anyway. Russia had already invaded Georgia in 2008, saying they needed a security buffer. In fact, we all know it was because they were opposing the Rose Revolution and what the Rose Revolution meant for the regime in Moscow. Russia invaded Armenia in the 1920s, again, to secure its borders, the same in every Soviet republic. It was an old excuse. That was the Russian Civil War, a fascinating time in history if you want to read about it. It was also managed and run by one of the most interesting people in Russian history, which is Leonid Trotsky, of course, who got a nice pick in his head in Mexico from Stalin when he opposed him. It's a long story. For the matter of Poland coming in, they came in 2009. They were the center of the Warsaw Pact and the second largest army. Why wouldn't they invade them? So there was no real system to me. Of course, there's the idea of having a buffer state and not wanting it and feeling encircled. But these are subcontexts to what I would say are the more deep-seated reason. I apologize for all the words on this page. I did it also so that you could get it and read it. So that's part of the reason behind it. That's what everybody says when they didn't do their PowerPoint correctly, but it's actually true. There's a long history. And again, if you're interested, there's a great book by James Billington called The Icon and the Axe, which you might want to read. It's very good. I can give you a reading list if any of you are interested. More than any other power, the Russian Empire itself, more than the French Empire, more than the British Empire, more than the tiny German Empire that actually flew up, the Tsarist system organized its subjects through their confessional status. In this case, the confession being something like the Nicene Creed, in this case in the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Creed. And it understood its boundaries in those contexts. Essentially what happened was Moscow saw itself as the last remaining orthodoxy after the fall of Constantinople. They rejected Rome as the center of the church, as you may or may not know here. I don't know how much history of the church you do beyond the Catholic Church, but you probably had to look at the schism here and then the split off of the Russian Orthodoxy. The Russians defeated the Mongols. If you know about them, they came sweeping across the plain, Genghis Khan and all those really bad B films that you can see of the Mongol invasions. They were one of the largest empires in the world, but they conquered them and took over Crimea 1783. And in Russia's imperial identity was to identify itself as Russians were Orthodox, that is Christian Orthodox, and everybody else, all foreigners, were different. The important part of this, and I won't bore you with this anymore, but Ukraine was part of that. They took over Ukraine. I think I have it here under Catherine the Great in the 17th century. Catherine the Great in 1774 took over Crimea, and her reasons given, and Orlando Figgis has written a good book on this, the reasons given it is the seat and the origins of the Russian Orthodox Church. An important quote here is at the very end, which is, in the ancient Greek colonial city of Chersonios, which is on Crimea, near Sevastopol. I'll show you on the map in a minute. Vladimir, pagan, converted to Christianity in Chestosis in 988 and married actually the daughter, the 27-year-old daughter of the Byzantine Empire, who'd already rebuffed marriages from the Germanic lands and from French nobility. This was a pretty big deal. A lot of Russian historians have said the same thing as this one. The most important event in the history of all Russia, the conversion of Vladimir, which is pictured here, by the way, it's a very famous picture. The conversion began a new period of our existence in every respect, our enlightenment, our customs, judiciary, building of our nation, and religious faith, and our morality. This was somebody who was from Ukraine. He was the Prince of Kiev. Ukraine has been an indelible part of the Russian Empire. So go forward and you say, well, okay, all of it fell apart under the Soviet Union. Well, Soviet Union did outlaw religion, but there's very famous stories of KGB officers having to take their babies to their babushki, the grandmother, for baptism, because if they didn't, they'd get nothing but a hard time at home for the rest of their lives. So the Russian Orthodox Church was streaming through the entire time. When the Soviet Union fell in 92, I was living in Moscow at the time. Religion was no longer outlawed, and what happened was the Russian Orthodox Church began building a church on the ruins of Kherson, where I just spoke about, and they didn't ask the Ukrainian government for permission. They did it as if Ukraine was a vassal state. Had they tried that in Almaty in Kazakhstan or in Tallinn in the Baltic states, they would have asked permission, there would have been negotiation, they would have said no, they would have gone away. As a result, Ukraine and Crimea were really part of Russia, and Russia took part of its soul from Ukraine. You'll hear the term Kievan Rus, which is a very important part of Russian history, and Kievan Rus is the Moscow duchy that took over the Kiev operations and ran it. Finally, in this point was Putin actually airlifted a gazebo, which was the commemoration of his baptism on here, again, in the face of Ukrainian authorities. And in other words, Ukraine, to break away would be to rock the core of the origins of the Russian state. Not about energy, not about NATO. It was about the fact that Russia could not have its head ripped off, as some would say, by Ukraine going away. That means Russia's not going to give up easily, and they're not going to negotiate it. That's my main point here. So why does all this history matter? I tried to put it together. This, by the way, is a picture of the Holodomor with the distended bellies and the starving kids. The current events, NATO membership, Black Sea, pale in comparison to the Russian Orthodox Church. Ukraine and Crimea are the origins of the Orthodox religion. And then any reconstruction effort must consider the concept of no negotiation because of that background. We must instead view reconstruction as an urgent during the conflict to strengthen the Ukraine economy, to sustain the war effort, as I said. Only through rapid economic growth can Ukraine become stronger, and Russia will not seriously negotiate unless they are severely beaten. Military victory and reconstruction in Ukraine matter an awful lot, even in light of October 7th of this year. I think I'm making my statement. You guys can look into it and argue with me all you like. So I did you a favor. It's not so easy to find a good map of Ukraine right now with the battlefronts and everything else. This is 2022, so it's old. But this is Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Over here is Poland, Romania, Moldova, which is down in here. Belarus is up here. Belarusia it used to be called. And here, of course, is Russia. Kursk, by the way, is on this map. Is interesting. I don't know if you know much about World War II history, but the largest tank battle ever to have taken place, and still the largest ever, was in Kursk. 10,000 tanks were destroyed. That's a lot of tanks to be destroyed. And it took a long time to rebuild it for the Russian economy, which was lend-lease from us. So we built them up again. Kiev here is constantly under threat. I'll be going there in maybe in a few weeks. But the more dangerous place is actually over here in Lviv. They don't have any air defense. So I'd rather go to a place with an iron dome than a place without an iron dome. But here's where Russia is occupied. Of course, they took Crimea in 2014, as you may know. And then they occupied these areas in Luhansk and Mariupol, which is pretty important, Rostov-na-Donu. And these are the areas where they've been encouraging and trying to pummel into Ukraine. Those red ones are gone now. They've sort of given up on that offensive right now. And they're still here. Kharkiv, by the way, is the largest square in Europe. It's really ugly, but it's big. You'll see here, reading the news, that the Ukrainians are trying to barge through and poke a hole in this in order to divide the troops. And then, of course, you see here, these are the internally displaced populations that left. All they're doing is they're showing arrows going to West Europe, so that it's no big deal, but that's where they're going. The final thing I want to show is the assets, because I'm going to discuss the assets in a minute for reconstruction. You see you've got some pretty significant assets here. These are nuclear power plants, and I think I answered a question last week. About 55% of their power actually comes from nuclear energy, not from coal or oil and gas. And then there's nuclear power plants up here, which are significant as well. And then you've got a bunch of other assets, especially refineries for refining of oil right here, which are a big deal. If you cut that off, then there's no gas. But I wanted you to see this map, understand where we are. England's up here, America's over there, and Africa's, as always, down there. So here we are. So what was the main impact of the war? You know, they invaded on February 22nd, to a lot of people's surprise. And what were the main issues here? There are two things. I've discussed a bunch of other things on my last talk about economic impact, but really for Ukraine at this point in time, the main things were that internally displaced populations grew massively, which is not good. The reason why these two lines actually add up to more than the blue is because the blue are those who are registered as internally displaced, whereas these are the actual total amounts. You've got, as a result, you've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 6.8 to 7 million people on the move. You can imagine what that's like in a country of 44 million. It takes the number down to 36 million, which is a dramatic decrease. And here's what happened to the GDP, of course. It was humming around 6% in 22, and then it plummeted down to negative 35.5%. That, in essence, is the core of the major impact of the invasion itself. Very dramatic, very difficult, very hard to overcome. So, what was destroyed, and the cost to rebuild Ukraine? Where did it come from? How much was it? The World Bank, and again, the World Bank is another area when you start looking at it that does a lot of the estimates. And it's a very important institution created in the Bretton Woods systems in the 1946, actually. The World Bank does these estimates. It's one of the biggest aid agencies in the world, bigger than anything else, with the exception of USAID, which spends $60 billion a year, which includes humanitarian aid. But the World Bank matters a lot because it also controls the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. And that is the investment arm of the bank. The World Bank is the most profitable bank in the world. It helps when you have sovereign guarantees behind everything you loan. That helps your bank grow, but it's nonetheless a very important body. They did the estimates on this. And you can see here, as I said last time, the first thing to get canned is housing. The housing stock was destroyed, and then the estimates for the next 10 years to rebuild it all is $68 billion. You add all this up, so you got housing, transport, ag, and then you got these other things in the military side. They added it up. This was in February of this year, about $411 billion. Well, the European Investment Bank and the EBRD got together and looked at the forward projections of the war, knowing the war wasn't over when this projection was made. And the real estimate that everybody's working off of is $1.1 trillion to rebuild the Ukraine economy over a decade. That is a lot of money. I know you're growing up in an era where trillions are discussed now, right? I was, even under George W. Bush, our deficits were $238 billion. Wouldn't those days be great? Now they're what, 1.2 trillion? I mean, it's getting bigger and bigger. But don't forget, the bigger our deficits get, the less capable we are of meeting this big number. But the point here is that with the actual cost of 1.1 trillion over the next decade, that's a big lift for anybody. So I'm going to go through those lift and what it's going to take to invest that $1.1 trillion and some of the areas it's going to be in, and then some of the private sector issues. I will spend most of the time on this because I think it's important you hear it. You'll hear some of this a lot of other places. You won't hear this from many. You won't read it. You won't want to read it. I mean, it's there, but anyway. I tried to summarize several months of data for you. And this is actually original work, so I hope it's good. So the three things of best reconstruction, the first rule was that, other than an exit plan, which I will go into, but is the national governments have to be consulted, and particularly here, the use of funds by the donors and by private sector investments, the use of funds by the national government have to be managed by them. You can't have the United States come in and say, we're going to build a highway to wherever we think we want that highway to go. We've done that before. I've been part of programming where we decided to just rebuild agricultural fields and irrigation systems. Nobody wanted it. We got thrown out of Afghanistan at one point. We came back in 3 weeks. We said, sorry, what do you want us to do? So we did what they did. You got to be careful. Well, Ukraine's actually taken care of this quite well. I'll go into that in a minute. The second one is that the governance of Reconstruction, the donors need to organize themselves, and that means they need a governance structure. What they have to do is ensure that the national governments, while taking control of the funds, don't abuse those funds. If you remember, I talked about Greece during the Marshall Plan, where they abused the funds, and the US government cut them off. And when they cut them off, Greece got its act together, showed reasonable plans, and they didn't siphon off any more money, and then they got their money back. So we have to be very careful of that. And the players are big here. It's not like the Marshall Plan with one player anymore. It wasn't just one US. We've got considerable money coming in from the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, and others. And I'll show you that, in fact, the EU is spending more than the United States. So for you listening to the rhetoric in the United States on Ukraine, and say the far right will be saying we're doing all the work, it's actually not the case. Doesn't mean we're not doing a lot of work, but it's not the case. And of course, the third issue is that the private sector has to be prepared, but more importantly, the private sector has to be allowed to freely and to eventually shoulder most of the reconstruction itself. If it's not, the reconstruction will flounder. We'll pour in $200-300 billion. They need $1 trillion. The $700 billion will never show up because investors won't put their money in. So I'll go over some of those areas which would be of interest. On the first one, What they did in Ukraine was in April 2022, the National Council of Recovery for Ukraine was formed under the office of the president. They hadn't had that before, nor did they have presidential oversight in the way they did. The institution was charged with developing, and the proposals were made much, much prior to the donors pouring in money. That was actually quite unusual, because it's usually the other way around. We show up with our carpet bombing them with consultants. We get off planes and we have little briefcases. And then we figure out where to spend. Ukraine actually came at us with what they want to do. In 2022, the recovery conference was set up in Lugano, and that was where the number of 750 billion came, because they said 411 billion isn't enough, then $1 trillion, and then they reiterated this in London in June, where I was. And then they had to support the achievement of those targets. So what they did was they put together 15 national programs in order to show the donors of all their spending how much they would actually be able to spend and where they would be to spend it. I've color-coded it for you here. What did I say here? Blue is mainly the donors. That is the United States government and the EU. Green is mainly private investment. And then yellow is largely a mixture of both. There has to be public-private participation, as you know, and there has to be public procurement. Those are the big areas. But what's important from this is not to memorize any of this, but what they did was they had defense and security, EU integration, and then rebuild of a safe environment. I mean, we go on about the safe environment, it's kind of annoying, but it's really important to European Union. They don't want to have a restarting of coal production. They don't want to, they've got all these net zero targets. We can argue whether they'll meet those or not. That's another issue. But it is very possible that Ukraine can produce better energy at less cost. They're going to become a hydrogen hub, actually kind of like Steubenville is supposed to become a hydrogen hub, this area. Biden announced something like a $300 billion investment across the US. Very similar here, and they have the ability to do so. Then they spent a lot of time on macro financial stability. We were called in, my firm, I was with them, to look at their foreign reserves, their foreign exchange. And of course the IMF, which I said last time, is always at the apex of this. Nothing really happens on the financial side without the IMF either proposing it or saying we agree with it. If they don't agree with it, you're gonna have a lot of issues. So you gotta get to know what the IMF wants. And then of course we have these growing value-added sectors. You know, value-added is the gross revenue from an operation minus its costs. So you can produce grain, put it in a bag and put it out to sea. That's not very much value-added. What they want to promote is, say, the agro-industrial industry, where that grain becomes part of cereals and foods and everything else, and they're sold at a higher price, and that's the value added. That's how you get productivity per worker up. I'm sure if you're doing econ here, you've already studied the value-added process and the value-added tax. If you haven't, you should learn, because the value-added tax is coming to America, I'm afraid. I hope not, but I think it is. And then, of course, there was the whole thing about targeted and effective social policy. The big issue on this one, and I don't want to minimize it, I didn't mean to put it in the bottom corner, they did, the Ukrainian the government. This is pension reform, and pension reform is the most volatile issue in any of these reconstruction operations, or any aid program itself. Pension reform, if it's not done well, will cripple a government, whether it's a totalitarian government or a democratically elected government. I saw this in Kazakhstan. We brought in the Chilean style of pension reform, which was where you invest your funds in the market. It's been proposed here in the US. Democrats oppose it because people start they'll take responsibility for their own investments, which they don't want. And they also invested only in government bonds, which is a subsidy to the Treasury. But the pension reform is a pretty big deal in all of these nations, and they want to get this right. I predict they're probably going to go towards a Chilean style, or the kind of pension reform we did in Kosovo, which is you have, like a sovereign wealth fund, you invest in portfolios overseas and the stream of income comes back. But if you don't get the social programs right, in particular pension reform, you'll have massive instability and you will have a failed state, basically. The other thing they had to do in order to convince the donors and show that they were actually going to be using the funds correctly was show that they were playing along the lines to EU accession. Now, most of you, I think you know what EU accession means, right? The European Union started off as a triumvirate between, I'm not going to say axis, it was a triumvirate between Italy, Germany, and France in the 50s. And then slowly they came up to bring, Britain got involved only reluctantly. They never joined the currency zone. They always had the pound. But the European Union's been growing and they've been expanding. And recently they've added the mega states of Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and now, as you know, of course, you've heard of the EU. Well, EU expansion is always a goal. When I started giving advice in Ukraine in 1992, when we were first allowed to go in, all the work that we did, all the reforms we did, all the public financial management reforms we looked at were all about how to accede to the EU. What kind of criteria would they have to have? What kind of oversight would they have? What kind of financial management information systems would they have to have? All of that is here, but the most important one is this one, and that is anti-corruption. And why is that? Because Ukraine, up until right now, it was and is still perceived as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. We're talking Pakistan corruption. We're talking Bangladesh type corruption. They're on that level, and they used to get ranked very low. I have to say, from what I've seen, they've made enormous strides in Ukraine towards cleaning up their corruption, and they have some pretty high-powered anti-corruption bodies, which they never would have agreed to before. And the Verkhovna Soviet, or that's not the Soviet, the parliament itself has approved measures for a oversight fund, an individual appointed independent of the government, some very powerful things. You might also have heard in the news that a Supreme Court justice in Ukraine was arrested for embezzling funds, and all of these things were done by Zelensky in order to assure the Americans that nothing would go wrong. Deloitte itself has a direct budget support work that we're helping them with, and one of the main criteria that we are asked to, Congress will often ask USAID for how's it going, what's the oversight, and then they come to us as a contractor to say, how are the spot checks going? Are they spending the money correctly? And they are. They're doing a very, very good job. We can only hope that that keeps going. This takes a long time to get over this. I can assure you that if there's one big anti-corruption incident in the next few years, that's going to be a big deal for Ukraine. And I think the military understand that, and they'll come down pretty hard when they do, because they know their money is tied to this major issue. That's rule one. They've got good plans. They understand what they have to do regarding convincing the West that they're doing it. They know they need to get into the European Union as a club, and they know they have to prove to the world that they are taking on corruption full bore. I believe they are, and I really do believe they are. The next one is this, and that's the governance of the donors. And this is important to look at. Now, this isn't mine. This is from the German Marshall Fund, which does really good work. There's somebody that, if you want to Google, if you're doing essays on this, you should look at their work. It's quite good. But they came up with this, and it's pretty much in line with what we said. I think if you remember from when I was here the last time, that the Americans were in charge of the Marshall Plan in Japan. Therefore, they could manage everything at the Marshall Plan in Japan, and they could succeed in how they allocated those funds, cut them off, do whatever they wanted. That world doesn't exist anymore. There's, first of all, $1 trillion is too much money. The US doesn't have that, not alone, and we need to bring in the private sector. So what they came up with was a pretty important thing. The one thing that you want to look at and understand is civil society here. So we've got an oversight capability here. We've got the technical expertise. That's usually where I would dance if I was invited in. Financial oversight, which is where you have guarantees of investments. And then you have the political side, and I'll go over this in a minute. This one is important to look at. These are the United States. We have an inspector general. They'll look at how we spend the money. The European Union have their inspector generals and how they spend the money. But in Ukraine, we don't, it's not a very big, long tradition of oversight, or we don't trust it. Civil society is one of the key areas. But they're the ones who play watchdog and make sure that the money is being spent, and it's being spent on the right individuals and people. So they've incorporated this. This is a really important thing. Civil society are groups and NGOs, CSOs, that go down to the local level, the municipal level, the provincial level, oblast, or to the national level, and they advocate for things like proper budget expenditure, proper oversight, adequate pension reform, everything like that. It's a pretty big step. The next one is the technical side. That's where we come in, and they'd staff it with a project. Each of the projects have to be implemented, and they have to have a staff on them. This becomes a pretty big, these two rings become pretty populated with players. And you got to be careful how many are here, and you got to limit your task force sizes on the technical side. It gets a bit better when you go into the financial and the political. Here's what is probably going to be insisted upon in Ukraine. A heavy American hitter who would be in charge. This was what they did in Kosovo. The UN sent in Bernard Kouchner, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for France. They made him in charge, very practical, linear thinking, Descartes type. And he brought in the Americans because he said the Europeans are going to screw it up. And he was very French and very skeptical of the EU's ability to do anything other than the French. But he trusted us and the Americans, and we knew we had the money. So he brought us in. We need the same thing here. And the proposals, the kind of individual this would be, say, a Mitt Romney would be one kind of individual, or a Lloyd Austin, the current Secretary of Defense. Someone like that who's got access to the White House, is trusted by whoever goes into the White House, and then can therefore run the show from the American side. And then on the EU side, you've got a joint appointment of coordinators. This one's more difficult because the European Union, as you may know, has a single monetary authority with the euro, but they've got however many states there are, 17 or 18, I forget how many. Those are all individual countries with individual fiscal authorities, individual budgets, individual populations, individual elections. So they're much more scattered, and they have to spend more time on it. On this side, the political side is going to be appointed by the president's office. It'll be more clean and more neat. The last one is the financial side, and this matters. The international financial institutions, the IFIs, like the IMF, the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the European Investment Bank. They all have directors on it from the United States. I don't think the EIB does, but everybody else does. From the United States, from the countries in Europe, and Ukraine has its own directors. They're calling for those directors to staff a small body of about 16 individuals, where the veto of a evenly round-tabled voting core would be broken by this individual, the American coordinator. And of course, the reason for that is the Americans' heavy investment in the military and the stability which they provide. So you can, again, take this if you want and look at it, study it. There'll be other proposals that'll be coming, but I think the German Marshall Fund pretty much nailed it as to how it's probably going to look. I just wanted you to see the spending, because I think it's important you want to know who much is spending. And first thing to note here is on the humanitarian and financial side, the Europeans are putting in substantial amounts of money, $77 billion as opposed to the US, $24 billion. So let's just understand the numbers a bit, that the United States is certainly carrying the heavy military burden. There's no question of that. But if we want to add up all the money that's gone in so far, the Europeans are clearly carrying their weight. So, by the way, is Germany and the UK, and even Canada, which has a huge Ukrainian population. In fact, that statue of the little girl I showed you of the Holodomor, that's a recreation in Saskatchewan, because we have a huge Ukrainian population in Canada. That statue is in Kiev, but the original one, but they recreated it in the United States. So you can see the spending here. Yeah, I converted it to dollars. You just basically divide by 0.992 because the euro's a bit stronger. So the EU's put in about 90 billion so far, 74 for the US, Germany, UK at 15, and then it goes down the list. But I think it's important you see the numbers and get an idea of the magnitude. So there's a few slides here which are important, and I don't want to repeat myself too much on them. And I know I've only got 20 minutes left, and I want to have you time for questions. So let's just say there's 6 conditions, and I may actually want to skip over the rest of the slides and just go on this one. But the real thing to remember here, because you won't remember any of the details I speak about later, the real thing to remember here is that Ukraine can't engage in serious reconstruction programming without large-scale privatization. I've said that a couple of times. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I've been asked by a company, to look at the absorption rate. Can they absorb $1 trillion? What will it mean? And the question is not really an accurate one. They can absorb any amount of money. The question is, how much will they screw it up? How much will it screw up the economy? How much will it cause hyperinflation? Do they need to sterilize all that donor money coming in? Is it going to cause distortions in the wage markets? But that's only for about the $300 billion that the donors can afford over the next decade. What they need is another $700 billion in private investment to come in and rebuild. That money won't come in unless the Ukrainian government does a certain number of things and the donors help them meet those requirements of what an investor needs. So while the donors can set themselves up in a governance structure, which I went over, and the Ukrainians can set up a public platform of how to manage their operations and plan their spending, the private sector isn't going to be centrally planned. Nobody's going to tell them to go here and go there. They have to be incentivized to invest. And if that's the case, what the donors need to do with the development finance corporations on their side is they need to engage in what's known as investment guarantees. Now, I don't know if you've heard of the Development Finance Corporation, the USIDFC. They're a new organization which was formed a couple of years ago. They create investment guarantees for bank loans and for other investors to go in. The EIB creates incentives, and there's funding and money here. There'll be a bun fight with USAID that want to spend money on technical assistance all the time, and the DFC, which want to have funds available to support private investments. That's something that I think you see some aid is going to be flipped a bit, where the $300 million program we would have done in Iraq with 25 or 30 foreigners running around with stabs of 300 under them, those may be actually flipped, and that money will be made available for investment guarantees to make it run. On the other side, the government of Ukraine needs to do a huge amount of work. I'm going to skip over some of these and look at, here's the one I want to look at, as I said. The government of Ukraine needs to do some pretty significant things. One is anti-corruption reform, which I've mentioned already. They need to set that up. The capital investment project strengthening is also key. I'll mention what happened. I was made minister, co-minister with an Albanian Kosovar. I was made minister of Reconstruction in Kosovo. And a guy who worked for me, Alan Pearson, really, really good guy. He became the Minister of Finance, actually. And the two of us noted, and he became very senior when he became the Minister of Finance, of course. The two of us noted I was bringing in $3 billion worth of investment, which in Kosovo is a lot because it's not that big a place. And then he was Minister of Finance. We noticed that the current budget, that is wages and salaries to nurses and hospital workers and healthcare workers, whatever, was not in balance with the capital spending. So the UNHCR, there was a Japanese woman who was head of it for a long, long time, very powerful woman, really, but she's really influential. We sat down and she wanted to spend a whole bunch of money building new hospitals and new homes, and we had to actually turn her away. We had to turn away about 70% of her funds. And the reason is when you overspend on the capital budgeting side, you'll get 7 to 10 hospitals. They'll all get staffed with individuals in the first year run by donor money. And then if the current budget doesn't have the tax revenue or the tax base in order to fund that through its current expenditures, within a few years or maybe 5 years, you're gonna have to fire all those workers. You're gonna have white elephants all over the place of hospitals that aren't running, and you massively mismanage the expectations of the population. So the government of Ukraine knows this. They've been advised on it. We've spoken about it. Lots of companies have discussed this with them, and they get it. Ukrainians, they really know what they're doing. Now they've got to make very clear that the capital budget doesn't outpace the current budget. In other words, they've got to look at their tax revenues and their revenues into the budget. I hope I'm making that point clear. If you don't understand, let's talk about it afterwards, because it's nuanced, doesn't talk about it much, but it's a pretty important way to make sure that the whole effort doesn't go sort of flop at the very end of it. The next thing they need to do, I've already spoken about, is accelerate EU accession, of course, if they can. Although they're actually running ahead, and the EU is now starting to say, "Whoa, we weren't ready for all of this." And the Ukrainians that are in there, and people like me and others outside, are saying the EU has to actually meet them more than halfway, because if they don't meet them soon, and they say EU accession will take a decade, all those people who left Ukraine to live in Germany and France, they're 30 years old, and they say they're not going to accede until I'm 50, I'm staying here. I'm not going home. You don't want that. You need that human capital back. So they need to accelerate that very, very fast. And then Ukraine, of course, has to look at the major sectoral areas to be addressed through foreign direct investment. That's why they've set up a new agency called Ukraine Invest, and they've worked on how is it that we can attract investment into Ukraine. And that's in the ag sector, of course, because agriculture is really important to Ukraine, always will be. High-tech manufacturing, the energy sector, which they need to improve it better. And then, of course, there's renewable energy, which is a really important thing to the Europeans. And it is to Ukraine, because they can actually do it really, really well. But all of it takes investment, and it also takes a lot of planning and thought. Now, this is starting to go on now, but an awful lot more has to be done. These are a bit on, you can read this. This is a bit on the government, on the financial guarantees that need to go in place. There's a bunch of different types of guarantees that need to go in place and need to be spent on. So let me finish off with what I have here. First of all, this is a statue outside Kiev on the river. When we lived in the Soviet Union before the breakup, we called it Dочь Брежнева, the daughter of Brezhnev, because Brezhnev, who you may know, was head of the Soviet Union, hardline man from 1963 until I think he died. I'm going to get messed up, I think in the 80s. But it was important. They're changing that. That's a Soviet symbol, by the way, of the USSR. They're going to alter that. But this is it's a huge statue. So let me summarize what I have said before and what I mean now. The war was started by Russia for deep-seated reasons. They're not going to be bought off by land, energy, or diplomatic concessions. There won't be the smoking in the back room and everybody goes home and they agree. That's not going to happen. That means that peace will not be negotiated over quote-unquote things. That implies that Reconstruction has to happen now. We can't, there is a fight. Let's wait till over, then we'll see what we do. No. We have to start it now. We can. If you saw the map, there's huge swaths of the country that can take peaceful investment. We have to make sure that that goes on. In the background, the Ukrainian government has to convince foreign direct investors that it's worth having. The 3 rules of best reconstruction I've spoke about here already, those are going to be implemented and have to be done. And then a major political goal for Ukraine, and this comes up with private investors all the time, is somehow, some way, they need to fast-track NATO membership. That's very difficult. We were at a conference with Stoltenberg, the tall Norwegian guy who's the Secretary General of NATO. He's got a problem because I think it's Article 5, that if there's an attack on one, it's an attack on all. So it's very difficult to bring in Ukraine, which is currently at war, because then that means everybody goes to war. So they got to be careful about that. But all investors are really looking for at this point is for someone to say, here's the calendar, here's the plan, here's the sequence by which Ukraine will be admitted into NATO over X many years. That will be a really important thing to stimulate foreign investment. And then the other one is to remember what I said, that the battle for Ukraine is really an existential issue for the end of the Cold War with Russia and to containing Russian chauvinism. People bristle at the term containment. There was a term that came under Truman, of course. The Truman Doctrine was to contain the Russians. But this is, in a sense, what it is. And I really hope that we don't take our eye off the ball because of Israel and Gaza. We can fight a 2-front operation. We can work on 2 regional wars. We can even do 3 if it's Taiwan. That'll mean some diversion of spending from our domestic agenda, but that's always been the case in the United States. So these are my reasons, and this is about the reconstruction of Ukraine. Thank you. Sorry, I went too long, but whatever.
Thank you, Steve. Any questions?
What types of incentives do you think would best benefit this in terms of preventing corruption? Because I know you were saying to offer incentives, but also how do you prevent corruption on the part of the investor?
Yeah, one of the ways to do it is digitization of the process. The public procurement process is at the apex of this, and public procurement is a big issue with the WTO. You have to have proper systems in place. But if you have a blockchain operation, which is used all the time, a blockchain procedure, which is used all the time now, and you have a digitized process by which procurements are let and how they're judged, you can pretty much track whether there's been some deviation in funds. The other one is financial management information systems, FMIS is what it's called, have been introduced in Ukraine, and they have them. Let's not forget, I didn't mention it, but Ukraine has a very, very comprehensive procurement agency. I think it's Pro Rata, I think is what it's called. And it's kind of cutting edge for the world, actually. So those are the ways to do it. You got to make sure everybody knows they're going to get caught if they try and cheat. So.
I have a question, actually. There's a neo-isolationist movement in the US, and the question is, why should we care about Ukraine? I mean, you hear about grain prices, oil prices, perhaps the use of weapons of mass destruction, bombing nuclear power plants. But why should we care? What would be the answer to that?
Well, one issue is when we talked about the current inflation and the hit that we've had to our economy, which is riling our political structure now and dividing everybody on how we should react to inflation, how we should react to unemployment. Don't forget, a lot of those things we're saying, well, the supply chain was interrupted by the war in Ukraine. If these wars and these big regional conflicts are so bad, we do pay a huge economic price. The second issue is not all wars are the same, not areas are the same. There are regional conflicts in Africa, which we don't even discuss right now. They're not necessarily worth going to the mat over. This is Russia, this is Ukraine, and it is on the level of a European war. And the isolationist versus globalist argument has been around forever, and the isolationists almost always lose, often too late. Is the problem. I think we should learn from that.
Going back to the Truman era, the Molotov Plan was created in response to the Marshall Plan, and with countries that are now struggling economically in relation to the Soviet Union, is the Molotov Plan in any relation to how they're struggling with the fundamentals of that plan?
No, I think the Molotov Plan was, as I understand it, was this extension of central planning and a series of subsidies to client states, quote unquote. Play ball with us, announce fealty, and we'll put our military assistance in place. Egypt, Ansar Dam, Egyptian troops. By the way, watch Goldo, the new film, which is about the '73 Yom Kippur War, which just discusses this issue. So it wasn't done in the same way. It was done to build a Russian empire, to build Russian influence around the world. The Marshall Plan was done to enrich Europe, to make sure Europe got reconstructed and have a trading partner based on market gains, whereas the Soviet Union didn't have market price indices. So the Molotov Plan, nobody really studies it all that much. I'm glad you've looked at it. I think it's because it really wasn't that good. So.
Other questions? Okay. Thank you,
Thanks,
Steve.
guys.